Actually, before we start, I'm going to just show you an image of this real quick. This is my handy dandy foot model, because why would I not have a foot model? But this is the way that most medical professionals and stuff view the body, which is the red stuff is muscles, the white stuff is tendons, you get some ligaments, the yellow stuff is nerves, and you start to see this. It's like, okay, and then you at the very bottom of your plantar fascia, which is, essentially kind of demonstrated there. But, obviously this is an anatomical model. You have your bone on the inside. And so the way they look at the body is that, okay, bones are compressive, they absorb force, muscles pull on bones for leverage, tendons connect muscles to bones, ligaments connect bones to bones. So you get the ligaments down here. This is, stuff like on the inside and the outside. That's where people have ankle sprains and they tear those. And then nerves communicate to the central nervous system. And that's all true to a degree, but it's not sufficient to be able to describe the phenomenon. Shoot, my thing's coming apart. It's not sufficient to be able to describe the phenomena of the body. So just as we spent time in a moment ago working on, there is an entire experience of rotation that happens when you stretch and pull on your tissue in a circular motion. And what you felt around the ankle, that innervated stretching tingling thing when you do those ankle circles, that's something. All right. And so what is that thing? That is fascia. Yay. Okay, good. All right. So the plan. Today we're going to talk about 5 major subjects, and we're going to start with tensegrity, which is a fancy word, but you'll know what it means, and you'll be super happy about it. Then we're talking about how the body, a better way to think of the body, it's all just tissue differentiation, fascial lines, and why you've never heard of it before. And you'll see that I did really good at getting the first 2 like pictures and things, and the third one was good, and then I ran out of time to get the fourth there because I did so much time on the front end of reading and studying and writing and prepping and scripting that when I got to the presentation, I ran out of time. So, number 5 is a little more conceptual, but we'll get there. It's lame. But first, let's talk about tensegrity. And so, if you haven't heard of tensegrity before, this is an exciting day for you because tensegrity is a new way of understanding everything about your body. And so, the traditional model was a gravitational compression model. And we'll talk about a little of these things as we go through. But tensegrity is a fancy word that is basically the mashup of tension, and integrity. So tensional integrity, tensegrity. We'll talk about where these terms come from. There's a big fancy word for what it means when you smash 2 words together, but I don't know what it is. But essentially, it's a model of tension and compression. So I tried to put a lot of pictures in here because you just can't understand this until you can see it, which is a big reason that we never actually understood this model beforehand, because it was we needed to have a way to visualize it. And so we'll come back to that process. But what I want you to notice first off is that when I say tension and compression, those are the 2 aspects of tensegrity. So the integrity of a thing. If you have any questions, please just throw them in the chat. Oh, thank you. Yeah, perfect. God, Keon, these are good. Yeah, any questions, throw them in the chat, and I will get to them. I will do some questions to answer at the end. But in this picture, this is a model of a tensegrity model. What you'll notice is that it's 3-dimensional, so it's hard to tell, but these wooden struts, or these compressor studs per se, form the compression. And then these white or light blue strings, so to speak, they form the tension. And so none of these struts are touching. They are all floating in space in a system that is self-correcting and self-tensioning based off of this constant relation of tension and compression. So the pioneers, the first person who really built some things around this he's now passed on, but Kenneth Snelson. So he's an artist. He started to make these tensegrity models. What was it called that at the time? He preferred the term floating compression, but he started to make these models in the 1940s and started to get bigger and bigger. And obviously, because we are, kind of bound by gravity, he needed something that sits on the ground. But if you took this structure into space, it would still maintain its same position. So it wouldn't fall apart. Unlike a house, if you took a house to space, obviously we have things like nails and screws and glue to hold it together. but the structure itself would fall apart because it doesn't have gravity to hold it together. So you could build like the Colosseum, for example, which is just, rocks on top of columns, which is on top of rocks, a roof, walls, pillars. Those are just based off compression, and they use gravity to hold it. But if gravity were to change, you would no longer have the structural integrity of the system. So Kenneth Nelson starts making these things in the 1940s, and this is the first time that we're able to actually visualize something. And so I know that sounds interesting, but so much of the way that we learn to describe the body, if you notice that, the brain's like a hard drive, we have to load, we have RAM. That language wasn't invented until we had computers and hard drives. And so even now we have cryptocurrency and decentralized computers and whatever that stuff is. Now we can start to think about fascia as a decentralized way of understanding the intelligence of the body. So never underestimate the fact that the things that we are often discovering about ourselves are happening with parallel discoveries about technology. So as we create and invent and discover technology, we develop a language and a way to understand ourselves and this world through this parallel process, because we're actually pretty bad at looking at ourselves and seeing ourselves for what it is. Until we can see and go create something else in the world that kind of mimics what it means to be, one aspect of this, then we really struggle to see that in ourselves. So this is a big step forward. So Kenneth Snelson starts doing this as this guy OG over there, but in these little small models. Then Buckminster Fuller, Buckminster, one of the two. I might have misspelled it. He's an engineer, or actually he's an architect. I meant to change it. He's an architect, and in the 60s, he saw Snelson's work and he coined the term tensegrity, which he was the one that said tension and tensional integrity. So Buckminster Fuller is brilliant. He's just one of those guys that's like way ahead of his time. The dome, I think the geodesic dome, or I don't know, maybe it's not that, but it's he uses this kind of model, which is like the stretch. It's using this tension to create a self-supporting structure that would hold together. And so you start to see this relationship between the struts and then the tension elements in between. Obviously, it's looks slightly different, but it's the similar concept of like there's constant tension. And so what I think is interesting, if you start to take fractals and understand this, when we talk a little bit more about tissue differentiation as we get on, when you think about the egg, like the egg and sperm, the I don't know, the ovulative, whatever, the egg, the women ovulate thing. And remember this picture of the dome. So he used these three terms to kind of describe the categories or principles or whatever you call them to describe tensegrity. So it's a self-supporting and self-correcting system. It means it doesn't require gravity. It doesn't require anything outside of itself, meaning it's not using glue or other aspects of things to hold it together. It itself is held together. So it provides both the structure and the system, the form and the shape, so to speak. And it's self-correcting. So if you make an adjustment, if you compress any one side, the whole thing compresses. If you extend any one side, the whole thing extends or pull apart. And so most of this we see in like art and in kids' toys. It's kind of, we see that now where you can like pull, you can compress. And they're not perfect models, but you need some, because most of them have just plastic rotation toys and they're screwed together at the corners. But you imagine that little thing where you could pull the thing apart and you could push it together, or whatever that kid's toy was. It's self-correcting. So basically, when you stretch one part of the system, something else compresses, and so that's why most people struggle with stretching. They never see many benefits because they're kind of just making small little contractions, small little stretches, and they're not thinking about a global system. It does not require any internal, vertical, or horizontal supporting structures. So basically, something that becomes if you think of a house, the walls, the studs, those are internal, vertical, and horizontal things that basically, hold it together. So this dome, for example, is a dome. There's nothing in the middle of the dome that's supporting it. It is just the outside structure, or if you look at Snelson's things here, the structure itself going around, and obviously this is drilled down to the ground because we have rain, we have a bunch of different other stuff, but the thing he's holding here, or even this picture here, the thing itself provides the structure, and it's not being held together. It doesn't have a beam that goes across to hold it, to keep it in place. If you've ever built a deck or a wall, you put horizontal studs in there to make sure that it's stable and safe. And then it contains isolated, non-touching compressive studs that exist within a continuous tension system. So that's an important one because we look at this idea of in non-compressive or non-touching studs, these wooden studs basically aren't touching, but they're held in a constant tension. So they are very stable, much in the same way the studs in a wall are stable, but these aren't touching. And so it's a new way of visualizing structure. And so there's two parts of this. One of which is the thing, the shape, the structure of the thing itself, but also is the thing within it that it affords. For example, with the compressive model, there's you don't have space. You have walls, you have pillars, but that is basically held together by matter. So, for example, if I have in order to create a space within it, if I want to have a room, I need to have, like even just a Coliseum, I have to have pillars, or I have to have something that creates a vertical support, something a foundation to drill into, and then something on top to have a roof. And so all of that comes at a cost because there's a certain loss of space. And so how do you create that space without then having the same, the space within the egg, the space within the dome, the space within the structure? It's like that creates a decompressed area where something may exist. And so the only way we knew prior to that was to have an outsource that compression to the structures around the outside, but then drill down, and we required a bunch of different stability. And so you can have things like rooms and buildings. But there's a new way of thinking of like that relies on gravity to press down. So if we try to take that to the body and go say, oh, well, the body must just have the bones. The bones are the big studs in the wall, and they press down, they touch into the ground. So we think of ourselves, and that's why you get this idea of like the spine gets compressed, and we need to decompress the spine, or the knee wears down tissue, or you have this idea. All the modern rehab, prehab, medical thing is based off this compressive model, but it doesn't make sense. It doesn't connect, and so the one thing with tensegrity was fine, but it started off looking at things in the body. And so that guy, Donald E. Ingber, he's a biologist. He noticed tensegrity relationships at the cellular level. So this is just the 3D models, but the cells come in many, many different shapes. But what you generally have a nucleus, you have organelles, you have different compartments of the cell, you have a cell wall, you have a cytoplasm. So the cell wall, again, is structured a lot like a dome in a sense. You have this tension and compression, and we'll talk about what that looks like a little bit more. But tension and compression elements that hold that together and create structure. And so within that dome, you have these smaller parts. You have organelles, which are these tiny little smaller sub compartments of it. But it's we'll talk about. I'll come back to this. But basically, you see these same patterns, this tensegrity relationship, all at the cellular level. And so here's an old picture of him in the 90s. So this is in the 70s. I think he starts to notice that, and then in the 90s, somewhere in there, maybe I don't know what the exact dates are, but you get this surgeon and Dr. Stephen Levitt, who coined the term biotensegrity because he realized there are differences. The tensegrity relationship is there, but it's not, it's manifests slightly differently in the body, and there's ways we can relate to that. So rather than thinking about like, oh, tensegrity always means this, then we try to go and shape it like a dome or these tensegrity structures. It's like, well, the tensegrity relationship is simply just compression and tension. And so we started noticing what he basically saw was he saw things that didn't necessarily make sense. So, for example, when he would go in and do surgery, if he loosened some tissue, the bones would come further apart, and it wasn't related. And so basically, you would think that the bones are attached to one another and they're held together. But if he did something to the hip, the knee bone would start to kind of create space. And so he started to notice a difference in that couldn't make sense. And also the fact that you had soft tissue that was within very firm, dense hard tissue, like, well, I guess bones are quite dense relative, but you started to notice this, like how is the soft tissue in here is not getting crushed, and how do we have space for organs, and how do the organs even hold themselves up against gravity? Why are they not just smashing down on your pelvic floor? And so what you notice is that he starts to notice these things, and he applies this tensegrity term to the body, and so this becomes his new way of focusing things. There's a pretty cool model over here. You start to see some of this stuff, but in a sense, your body resists gravity in a different way. Like if you took your body to space, and they're not mutually exclusive, so this is why it's important. But biotensegrity model is this. It has these basic things. It's self-correcting. So, if you let's say you want to contract your biceps, you're going to contract your core and your pecs and create a contraction. The more you flex your muscles, the more you flex your core. It creates this like tension around the body. The more you relax that, the more you relax and open up. And so self-correction, if you have a stiff area, everything self-correcting just means that when one thing happens at one part, the rest of the body compensates. So you get a maintained whole. You get a maintained. It's not a maintained whole in the sense of like there's not lost capacity. What you get is you maintain the stability and the integrity of the system. It's structural or tensional integrity, so tensegrity. So the integrity of the system has changed. If, for example, you see this model on the right side, if I were to press in and squeeze one end of one of those bands, the whole thing would kind of like morph and meld into that. So you can imagine if you have a kid's ball, which I do not have right now, but if you had a kid's ball and you squeeze it one part, the whole thing tends to connect in like and pull. So there's things that have this kind of like the structural, everything is connected. So there's nothing that's not connected. There's an efficiency in this, and this is incredibly important when we talk about the physical laws that develop the tensegrity structure of the body. It's not done. There's a wisdom to it, and that wisdom is efficiency. Everything is done in the most efficient way. If there was a more efficient way of stacking things, and this is something I still have more to learn, but it's like there's apparently these geodesic principles. There's like close stacking. There's organization. There's something around this, physical laws that basically dictate how things form, and it is done with a intention for a task in the most efficient way possible. And so what you see is nature optimizes for efficiency. We don't like redundancy in nature, so to speak. It's interconnected. Every single aspect of this is connected to the other part. There is no loss, in the same way that if you had I don't know, like the internet, the internet is all connected. So like if something happens, like it may not be aware of it. I would say that might be too big of a thing to envision, but imagine you're on a trampoline and you step on one end, you'll feel it somewhere else. So the spider, for example, no matter what touches the web, you can feel that change in tension based off of the compression that happened elsewhere. So muscles and fascia create the tension. So they distribute load. So when your body has to deal with, so at rest, if you were just to float in a tank, your body would have a certain resting position. And so the bones compressively resist that, and the muscles distribute load. So it's this thing that distributes the load of your body. Now, as you go through life and you deal with forces, you're jumping, running, throwing, you're picking things up, any external impact on your body, muscles and fascia distribute that. So they are the bending element that create the extra tension. So they kind of will touch and move. The bones compressively resist, but the difference is it's a constant pull and a non-constant push. Now that's what's important, because if it was a constant pull and a constant push, it would even out to zero. But because it's a non-constant push, this one took me a while, but I kind of wrapped my head around it. I'm sure I'm going to bumble it for you, but think about it. So there's a tension bridge, for example. If you go across a bridge, one of those, like, I don't know, the Golden Gate Bridge or any of these bridges we have, the tension elements are constantly pulling up. That's what keeps it up against gravity. Something has to offload gravity. But the material composition of the steel, or in the body, in case of the body, the bones, pulls only to, or pushes back only to a degree. So if there wasn't a push back, it would just, it would just, if there wasn't a push back, it would just contract into nothing. So for example, if you have a tendon that tears off a bone, immediately just it balls up, because it just continues to contract more and more. So you need the non-constant, meaning it's not always it's pushing to a degree. So the push is relative and the pull is relative, because it's not just one direction. But the tension is always, the tendons are always pulling on the bones, and the bones push back to the degree that their material is stretched. So once the bones are only going to bend so much. That's why they're stiff osseous structures. And once they get pulled to, once the tension once their material composition exceeds the force that the tension can pull on, there's no more push. So what you get is a structure that holds itself up based off of the relationship between the tensional pull of the muscle and fascia and the resistive strength of the bone, which is why when you start to see decompression, loss of height and things over time, people die. Osteoporosis, osteopenia, anything that weakens the bones weakens the integrity of the whole system, because you can't pull on that. Now, my friend in SEMA, for example, his bone mass density is 7.5 standard deviations above the average person. He's 255 pounds. He's my height, 8.6 body fat, 8.6% body fat. But his bones are so strong that you can hang a lot more muscle and you can distribute a lot more load. And so he's got a lot more density of tissue. He's a strong guy. So what you see is this relationship between your muscles, but you also see that the stronger your muscles get, the more they pull on the bones, which means the bones get stronger. So it's this reciprocal thing. You can't just take your calcium and think, oh, my bones are good. If you need to have vitamin D and vitamin K2 to be able to actually absorb and deposit that calcium, but you have to have a reason for the bones to be strong. And that doesn't happen just by load bearing, walking around. That's why people think they're going to go and like, I don't know, like water aerobics, or they're going to go do certain things that are just going to load their body and gravity's there. That's fine. And you need to have some level of that. That's good. But you also need to be able to pull this in multiple directions. Another way of saying what I just said is you do need the load. You do need to go load bearing, like running and jumping and doing stuff like that. That's why people do water aerobics, because it takes away the load of gravity. But remember that this system you see on the right works in a bunch of different directions. It's not, if you look at the space, it would still hold together. So you need to train your body in rotation and in pushing and pulling in these vertical and horizontal and rotational planes and all these different things that happen with life. And so the point of strength training that's done well is that it pulls your body in all these different things and creates a relationship with every set of muscle and fascial tissue in your body that then constantly and comprehensively loads bones, keeps them strong. That's the point of strength training. It's not like it's the load, but it's not the load you think it is. So, yeah, this is, so you don't need to read all this stuff. But the point is, now that's the first part. So now we're going to talk about the next part about the tissue. It's all tissue, because this is really important to understand a better way of seeing the body. It's all just tissue. But when it comes to fascia, there's a bunch of different types of fascia. Now remember, we are the ones who make things messy by dissecting and trying to label things. It's just tissue that is responding to a certain stimulus. But for the sake of helping you visualize and understand this, the fascia, which really forms and fills in every space of your body, is somewhat differentiated based off of how much force and how much tension it needs to have. So superficial fascia, which is right below the skin, that's the stuff when you do a fascial maneuver and you twist and you rotate, and like, let's say you take your hand and lean over to the side, that's what you're feeling. When you do those, you grab your ankle and did ankle circles, that's the easiest way to feel it. That's superficial fascia. That's also where your superficial adipose tissue. So there's the fat cells that kind of create that cellulite, that's right, that they get stuck, it's deposited in there. So in a sense, I mean, there's people who talk about different what that means, but whether it's energy deposits or just lack of movement or, I don't know, emotional trauma, I've heard a lot of different explanations for what that is, and obviously it's just, or excess energy your body's storing in places. But the point is that gets deposited in there, and so that cellulite, what that stuff is. So I don't know the specifics about what that is, but I just know that the body's a lot more complex than we like to give it credit for. So there's multiple areas, but that's deposited in there. You have your visceral fascia, which is the stuff that typically wraps around organs. And so this is just like, it's just deeper in your body. So this is where you'll get more of the visceral fat. So basically, just think about it. The fat that's right under the fascia that's right under your skin, because you have layers of dermis, you have layers of skin that then go down into layers of fascia, like ogres and onions, they have layers. And so the visceral fascia is the stuff that just does the same thing, but it wraps around the organs. It's a little bit denser, a little bit in more, or it's in that abdominal cavity. And so I think there's a definite relationship between, there's obviously stress, but stress, you look at the relationship between movement, stress, the hardening of the cortisol, alcohol, stuff like that, that layers on visceral fat, but also a rotation thing. I think there's a reason that people that can go and cycle and swim can still have high visceral fat, but most runners and most sprinters don't. And there's jujitsu, and there's guys, obviously there's diet and there's stress and stuff like that, but it's not just that. It's more of like the rotational squeezing, and if you can think of your abdomen, your core as like a wet towel, you wring that out. There's something about the rotation aspect. So if you have good spinal mobility, good abdominal breathing, and basically you can rotate your core, there's something, a relationship in there. I don't know specifics on that, but my hunch and intuition says there's something with the rotation. You have parietal fascia. That's denser tissue that lines the body cavity. So think about the visceral fascia is the stuff that wraps directly around organs. It's very protective. it's dense stuff, and it kind of hangs that in place. But the thing that you have different cavities, abdominal cavity, there's like different cavities. Your lungs exist in a cavity, your abdomen exists in a cavity, your pelvic floor exists in a cavity. And so the tissue that forms is kind of like, I don't know, the membranes that kind of separate these different, let's say, these different cavities is parietal fascia. And so in that you get this like serous fluid that kind of does this like hydraulic type of buffering. So it helps to, if you get hit, you're not just, same thing with the cerebrospinal fluid that would be an example of this, that is, keeps your brain kind of in place, so to speak. And then you get this deep fascia, which is, really the stuff that, this is the stuff that forms tendons. And I don't think, we like to think, oh, a tendon is one thing and fascia is another thing, but it really is just a continuation of this tissue. And so you look and see that the deep fascia, for example, is the stuff that wraps around muscles, attaches the bones, connects different sections together. So your aponeurotic fascia, it's thicker tissue that surrounds the muscles and connects broad areas of tissue to other tissue. The best example of this is your thoracolumbar fascia. So basically, above your pelvis on your back and below your rib cage, and connecting your lats and your traps and your QL to your glutes and your piriformis and basically the bones of your pelvis. That is one big stretch of very thick fascia. And so you can kind of see this in the right. There's like deeper fascia. There's just an example of the density of that. The superficial, ironically, the superficial fascia looks this way because it's filled with fat. That's the fatty deposits. This is just leaner because it's, it's different, but it's the thickness of that and how that's what differentiates the type. So your aponeurotic fascia is like, when you have gaps or spaces, that's what you're going to get, this denser wrapping paper, so to speak. It is the think of it as like really thick duct tape that kind of like you throw over areas to kind of like keep it. There are people who break a window in their car and they put duct tape over it to keep it, or something like that, a tarp. That's really what you want to think in there. Epimysial fascia is basically thinner connective tissue that wraps around muscles and then connects to bones. So basically, this is like the fascia that wraps, that is like the outermost. So when you get a chicken breast, for example, and you cut open a chicken breast and you peel that thing off the top, that's going to be your epimysial fascia. And so that kind of runs contiguously, and then it becomes the surrounding aspect. We talked on the Achilles tendonitis, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago. Basically how there's the Achilles paratendon. That's this kind of stuff. And so you just get differentiation of the tissue. So that was a horrible slide, but the point is you reflect your environment. This is, every single thing you do is just some type of emergent tissue. We'll talk about what that looks like in the next portion. But bones twist, harden, and dissipate based on the force. Your bones are, it's called Wolff's Law. Bones are constantly remodeling based on lines of stress, but slowly. Blood vessels grow and die based on circulation needs, and that's how much, fat tissue or muscle tissue, when you need tissue that has to be circulated, blood vessels grow or they recede. Muscles tear, reform, and become denser based on tension you put on them. So there's the sliding filament theory, they pull. Ironically, though, I do think that it's really the only thing that gets sore is the fascia, and fascia is really what's tearing around that. So the muscles will swell, there's hyperplasia, you'll get increased muscle fibers, and you can get, the muscles don't really change length, and you'll get increased fiber density. But the thing that changes is the fascia stretches, tears, remodels, and kind of like becomes more pliable. And so that's the thing that really makes sore. Tendons become stiffer, more pliable based off of plyometric stimulus, which is the condition of fascial movement. Connective tissue lubricates, remodels, and lengthens based on movement. So in connective tissue, that's just fascia. It's all like, but that could be tendons, ligaments, fascia. It doesn't matter. But that is the stuff that lubricates and remodels and lengthens based off of all the movement you do. And this is constantly happening. Every single minute of every single day, you are being laid down to a position. So right now, you have cells called fibroblasts that, if you're sitting down, are modeling the shape you make, which is why if you sit down for a while and you get up, you stretch, you're like, oh, I feel stiff, because your body was casting to that position. So Gil Hadley talks about it like this: is the fuzz, is that you have these cells that are kind of layering down new layers like the Zamboni or snow falling in the city, and you're constantly forming to the position you're in. And if you move, you wipe away that fuzz and your body stays healthy. And if you don't move, that starts to stiffen, just like snow piling up on back roads and parking lots. It starts to harden and you lose movement capacity. Now, the thing though is that in some places that's good. Like your IT band, you want a long stretch of very durable, dense tissue. You don't want that to be very flexible. And your plantar fascia, you want very dense tissue. So, you can move your toes and you can move your feet, for example, but you can't really move the section from the balls of your foot to your heel very well. Same thing with the palm of your hand. You can start to get some motion here, but there are certain aspects of this that your palmar fascia that you aren't going to be able to move well, so that's thicker. And so you look at the fascia that's running alongside bones, that tends to be stiffer, and that's what you want. So understand that everything happens in response to your environment. Okay, I'm gonna make sure I got all this stuff, the tissue. So yeah. The big thing to take away from that second part is that it is all just tissue. Everything is just tissue. We think about things like bones, ligaments, tendons, nerves, organs. Everything is just tissue, and it organizes based off of these consistent principles, which is what we'll talk about next. But it is all just tissue. So when you say you have an ACL or an Achilles tendon or a femur, it is all just tissue that is connected in this web of tensegrity. So the tension and compression happens because some tissue in the body is more dense and more firm, and other tissue is more pliable and stretchy. And the relationship between those tissues happens because of force. And so to go back to this thing, the big differentiator here with these aspects is that it is always remodeling. The difference is the time frame. So, I break it down in this way that you can have electrical stimulus changes immediately. And so, to the degree that our central nervous system is kind of an electrically based thing, which is really just chemistry, is the physics of like, the action potentials, as you have different elements that are like positively and negatively charged and pumped out. So you get these action potentials that fire. You can immediately have a change in physical electrical stimulus in instantaneous, the speed of light. And then to the degree that our imagination, our dreams, our thoughts, our ideas, our concepts, and to the degree that those are in that realm, you can change your mind. You can have a belief change or a change of an insight and learn something rapidly. So your ideas, the idea, like the electrical nervous system, whatever that whole set of like, connection to the ether is, that happens immediately. Then you get fluid. Fluid can shift and change quickly. So, if I'm feeling a little stiff, let me get up and just move. My blood will start pumping. I feel good. I can change and shift that. So that remodels rapidly. Then you get this superficial fascia, which is the next layer. That's the stuff that's right under the skin. You have a good connection to that. You can get tension. You can get traction with gravity, with connection. And so you can push and pull. That remodels quickly within the span of minutes. You can stretch. That's why after you get into start warming up, you start to feel good. That's because you started to get this top layer of the fuzz removed from your body, and you start to feel a little more limber. That's when the sweat starts to come. You kind of move that out of your body. So the fluid is moving. You've made the decision to move, so your body is flipped on. Your fluid is moving through your body, and now that's starting to connecting with the superficial fascia, which can remodel right away. Then you have muscles, and those take a few weeks to remodel. So you have to you have to stretch, you have to load them, you have to put either mechanical tension, metabolic tension, so a lot of reps, a lot of volume, and then there's volume, intensity. So like there's intensity, there's volume, and there's like the chemical like something, not having enough oxygen or something. So there's like three mechanisms. I forgot what they are for muscle growth, but that takes a few weeks, and your muscles start to regrow. You start to train, and like, oh man, I feel good. I feel my muscles get some hyperplasia, get some swelling. Then you have the deep fascia. So this is where you get like tendons. You get things like ligaments, tendons, connect the aponeurotic fascia, the stuff that wraps around. That takes about 3 to 4 months. And so people that do the foot course and the other courses I have, like the fascial, remodeling courses, or it's not just one, but those take months. And so you can kick off that process by getting the superficial fascia to move, and that can change that changes a lot of your sensitivity because all of the fascia is innervated. There's nerves that go to and everything. That's one thing that they used to think of it as kind of like, throwaway wrapper that's what it was. But, the reality is that like it's very innervated. This is the sensory intelligence of your body. Your muscles are your emotional intelligence to your body, and your movement is your language of your body. So those are the three pillars I like to break things down into. But when it comes to fascia, this is like it informs a lot of your stretch, your proprioception, the pressure, your feeling. There's a lot of that. I mean, obviously you have skin and nerve cells and things and stuff like that, but what do you think that communicates with? The fascia that is constantly connected, integrally and intimately connected to every part of your body. So the deep fascia that forms the tendons, That takes months. You start to really kick that process off, but you'll be sore. I mean, people would do the first week or two and they kind of desensitize their feet, they get them moving, they get some hydration, all of a sudden they feel amazing. It's great. Then they start to get real sore and they're like, oh man, this is taking some time. That's because the deep fascia is kicking in. And that basically just means that we need to have a long enough short, quick stimuli get a short, quick change. And so basically, we just either diagnose if it's important and if or it's not. And so, like, you're not paying attention to the clothes you wear. Medium intensity, so that there's just that. Let's say that stimulus continues to last. So you start to notice my shirt's really itchy. I'm going to eventually do something about it, or I'm really uncomfortable. I'm going to move. So we move to do that and continue. So that's the medium. So it's something that exceeds the threshold of our awareness, and that lasts long enough to make it meaningful. We will move. We'll extend energy to go and deal with that stimulus. And then the longer that happens and the more intense it is, that's when we get long-term changes. And so what you need to understand is that the remodeling happens as this deep fascia. It's gotten layered and layered and layered. So think about it like if you have a heavy snowfall on the city, and then the place that the main roads, the cars and the snowplows that go on, it doesn't really build up, it doesn't accumulate. But on the side of the road, you get these big ice, like these little, that takes a lot of energy from the sun, so that's pressure, so to speak, and movement. So you see this heat and friction that starts to get some motion, and it self-hydrates, and it gets the tissue to start to move and remodel. This is the release of hyaluronic acid. This is your self-lubricating system that now, in response to pressure, starts to release this tissue. Now the layers are starting to glide and they're smooth, which is why when you feel good, you feel at the end of the yoga class, I feel amazing. At the end of a long sit in the airplane, you're like, I feel stiff and stuck in a ball. And so, that's the relationship. It's this, are you getting tissue motion? And so the deep fascia just requires a lot more load and a lot more time and conditioning to be able to really remodel. And you have to unstick the stuff that's gotten stuck and then get it moving and then train it along the line it needs to move. So if your Achilles tendon has gotten stuck because you only wear hokas and you walk around and you barely move your feet, it's going to get stuck. And so you have to unstick that first, and then you have to restore range of motion, and then you have to condition it in a longer line of plyometrics. And that probably is something that would be a whole different presentation. If I could talk about all this stuff for hours, but conceptually, we'll talk a little bit more about that. I failed to do a good slide on that, but just redundancy, that's an important part. So the deep fascia takes months to remodel. Then you get bones, and bones take months, if not years, to remodel. I mean, they're slow. You get osteoclasts that break down the entire pull apart bone when it doesn't need to be built, and osteoblasts that build it up. So this is where you get when I first started lifting weights, I get a stress fracture in my forearm, or people get shin splints in their lower leg. That's because you're now loading it in a new way, and so you're going to have tissue. Let's just say your bones have gotten weak because you're not using them, which is why people lose bone mass density. But now, so your body's taking that. Calcium is really important. It's part of the nervous system. So if you're not getting enough calcium, your body's going to start taking that from something. So osteoclasts would do that. They decompose your bones, because why would I need this? Why do I need this much bone bone tension and compression and stability if I don't ever use it? So it's a constant. It's just always happening. It's always happening. It's all just tissue, and muscles can turn to bones. If you get hit hard enough and you repeat that stimulus, or you lose the movement stimulus, as happens to people who get paralyzed from the waist down, their muscles are starting to harden, and it turns into this myofibro ossitans or something like that. Doesn't matter. But the point is, everything, like, there's no difference in the tissue of your bone versus your ligament versus superficial fascia. It just, one of those things starts to get the location of the movements we do, the patterns we have, those become the way our tissue manifests. For example, if you lived in London, you would have a pattern of language that you would hear that would form the way your body expresses that language. And it's no different than if you live in Australia or India or China. The way you speak, the language you use, it's all just words and phonemes and things that come out. But the way we say it, the slang we do it, the way our body shapes and moves has to do with the environment we're exposed to. And so it's no different with movement. So understand that if you have a problem with tissue in your body, it's because you're getting a stimulus you don't want, or you're not intended, you don't understand, or you're not getting the stimulus you need. It is as simple as that. So the problems you have aren't these like major genetic things, or there's a major problem, or there's a major diagnosis. It's just stimulus. It's all just tissue. And the last one on that is nerves. Nerves take years to remodel, and they go very slowly. So basically, nerves are like really connecting or deeply connecting to your, I don't know, your sense of self, your identity, or your being. So there's corollaries to that, I think, in a spiritual side, which I think is cool too. But just think about that: electricity, superficial fascia, muscles, electricity fluid, superficial fascia, muscles, deep fascia, bones, nerves. Like there's a time scale. And so the point of that is to say, if your body's going to put energy and time and effort to making anything, it just depends on the time scale you make it happen. So if you are really consistent in something, your bones will change. So your bones tell a lot more about the story of your life than anything else. So, that's the thing. You can tell me that you've changed a new diet, changed a new belief, you're a whole new person. Like, what do your bones say? Because your bones are going to tell me what you've done for years. And so when your bones tell a story, when you go and you grab someone's hand, you feel the thickness of a bone, you feel the thickness of that, the deep fascia around their elbows, you feel like you know someone does farm work, you know their manual, you know what their life is. You can feel the calluses, you can feel someone's skin. They are a walking resume of who they are, what they really believe. So there, enough of that. So now we get in the third part, which is how we form. So this, I, it, I, it's, I don't know if I will not be able to do this justice, but it is just such a beautiful. I have this visual download of just everything from like the egg being penetrated by the sperm to this like slow emergence of like tension and compression as we go up. And I'm gonna try and explain this, but it is so important because you have to understand that fascia is not just a tissue. It is literally the glue that connects all these pieces. We just don't have better names for it. But again, it's all just tissue, so the names are all just made up anyway. So we're going to talk about this idea of hetarchy versus hierarchy, fascials, fractals of tensegrity patterns. God, these words just sound so big. The progression of micro to macro, and then the physical laws that prioritize efficiency. So a lot of this I'm going to have to just spit with golden tonsils, but we'll go from there. So let's talk on this first. The hierarchy versus hetarchy, so we don't lose that. Because I think, okay, yeah, that's the right off slide. Hierarchy is a top-down structure. So basically, when the king rules a kingdom, or the president rules like whatever, the dictator rules a country, whatever it is, like there's a top-down. So the in a typical meritocratic system, you kind of work your way up. And so we like to think of ourselves that way. It's like I am me, my brain, the internal dialogue or internal consciousness that it controls everything. I'm self-determined, we like to think about it that way, but we're really a bottom-up structure. We exist from the layers that go up. And so a hetarchy is something that looks like a hierarchy, but it is every single layer has distributed authority. So every single layer has the ability to have a dictation above and below, and they're all equally valuable. But there are hierarchies in the sense that the body will prioritize the heart over, let's just say, I don't know, the stomach, for example, or something, the brain over all. There's different aspects of the tissues of how we prioritize certain things that not all tissues are equal, but the structural aspect when we create them. So there's a difference between structure and function slightly, but the structural similarities of these things are all organized in this capacity. And so just stick with me. Hopefully I'll do this justice. But the body is organized. A hetarchy is just a much better way of explaining things, because that way it makes it seem, when you learn about it, it's like, oh, this is the body. It's a system. Now, these are organs. They're the most important part. And then we have our muscles, and we have our bones, and we have our tissues. And now those are composed of multicellular tissues, and those are composed of cells, and the organelles, and the mitochondria. And they go all the way down. This little, like, go all the way down. It's like, it makes it seem like you're the most important thing. It's like, but you don't exist if there's not organelles. And organelles don't exist if there's not atoms. And so we all need these pieces. And I get that that's somewhat obvious, but it changes the way when you start to see the structures, because it positions you as a piece of this thing. Like you are just as much your atoms as you are you, in a sense. And so very valuable to understand that. The most important thing is that the fractals of this, so fractals are just self-repeating patterns. By definition, a fractal is like the pattern is perfect and mirrored inside. And so there's a relationship between, there's this big one and there's a smaller one, and it makes it seem as though there's perfect symmetry between these, and there's necessary repetition. So fractals are somewhat unending. So if you keep going lower and lower, so there is a level of that is somewhat apparent, but it's not exact. So it's a fractal in structure, but not necessarily in function or form, meaning the physical laws that promote efficiency are true. They are what dictate every single deviate. So they're what dictate the accumulation of atoms, into molecules, of molecules into organelles, which are just structured cell compartments, of organelles into cells. So the same thing, basically, the laws that take, oh, these are a bunch of subatomic particles, oh, let's organize them into atoms, are the same as the laws that say, oh, these are a bunch of atoms, let's organize them into molecules, are the same that says, oh, these are a bunch of molecules, organize them in here. But again, it's not a fractal, because if it was a fractal, everything would be the same, and you would have this perfect, you would have this necessitation that it continues. And it only continues in so much as the next layer up provides efficiency for some task. I think that's really important. It is not necessary that the pattern continues. It only continues in so much as there's a need and the substrates exist. Meaning, let's just say that there's a government organization and you have a bureaucracy of fixing litter. Well, you only need, in inefficient government will just constantly make new bureaucracies and new things just because that's why California has 5 million laws about whatever, because it's the wartime, it's peacetime government. We have so much time. We're going to keep, it's like a cancerous thing. We're going to keep making more and more and more. But the body doesn't function like that in a healthy system. That's why it's not cancerous. In the need that there is some new organization pattern, it will create it will accumulate. So this is where people will kind of work at like a hive mind. This is where people were actually apex predators, because not necessarily we can use tools, but we can work together as a unit. We can come together and group together as a conglomerate of multiple individuals. And so the tension and compression, the compression are the individuals. So think about if we're going to go hunt as a pack, or you have a football team that's going to go out there. The compression is the individuals. Like you got a quarterback, you got a wide receiver, you got a running back. Those they could bend and move, but they're pretty stuck. The tension between them is the communication. And so they function together as a unit. The same thing if we have a hunting tribe or a political party or a classroom. These groups that humans go and put themselves into form this tension and compression model where there is a sustained whole. And if there's compression, the whole thing can do it. But eventually, if you break that system, you lose that connection to this integrated capacity. So my point, though, is humans don't necessarily organize in that way. And so you could look at nations as an example, and then they organize. And so you can see this pattern that goes up, but the pattern is just dictated by the laws of the physical laws that generate efficiency. That is the most important part. And that is what creates a similarity in the structure. It's like a fractal, but it's not. And so it's important to understand that. Maybe you don't think so, but I think it's important. So, but the point is that we form upwards through this. So now, let me get to a picture again. We form from the mic. I love this stuff. I got to just say, this is it's so cool. And hopefully, I don't know if anybody's still listening, but we'll get there. The micro to the macro. So we form from the small to the big. It's not the other way around. And the hard part is because we exist and we think about things from like, oh, this is me. I exist. I'm here. Oh, that means everything before me is now a preconceived necessity. But it wasn't that way. We forget the recency bias that these things just didn't pop into place as they are. They formed along lines of pressure with these repeated patterns and repeated stresses to do purposeful tasks with efficiency. So, what you see is this: we exist and we emerge, and so it's hard to remember that. But there was a time where we weren't the way, and even just where we are now is an emergent something. So it starts with atoms, and so atoms are these you can break in the subatomic particles, the electrons, protons, neutrons, which are these down here. And then there's quarks and nuarks and stuff like that are even smaller. And I'm assuming that they'll just continue going down to infinity or whatever it is. Who knows maybe we'll find God one day when we get all the way down to the best microscope ever. Who knows? But the point is, you see atoms. And so the thing is, most people look and say, oh, this is O2. This is oxygen. This is just a little oxygen ball and an oxygen ball, and they're connected. There's oxygen, and you get ozone, but there's oxygen as an element. And so you get atoms, which are essentially elements, which are things that cannot be subdivided until they lose. There's gestalt or something, which is a word I learned, is basically something that cannot be subdivided to less of a whole while still maintaining it. So if you take oxygen and then break it apart into it has 8 electrons, 8 neutrons, 8 protons, you take oxygen, the element, and break it apart into, well, I'm going to take those 8 electrons, put them over here, my neutrons over here. It's no longer oxygen. The fact that there is a relationship between these things is what makes it oxygen. Now, you have oxygen gas, which is O2, which is a different thing. It's a compound. That's a molecule. But the atom exists because of the relationship. So what we often see is, this little ball. But this ball is held together by neutrons and protons that are held together tightly. They're packed into the nucleus, and they're surrounded by a cloud of electrons. Now, even though that looks like it that is a thing. And to the degree that it is stable, you can pull the electrons away. You can attract them. That's the reduction and oxidation of atoms. But to the degree that you look at that, that's a thing. And so it's important to understand that the electron is a thing. Actually, it cannot be subdivided any further. It's the smallest. It has essentially no mass. It's a thing. But so electrons do exist in isolation. So there's kind of flow, which is the whole point of grounding and earthing, which that'd be another discussion. But like this thing is a thing. Like that unit is a thing. And if it starts to lose pieces, it no longer becomes a thing. And so if you look at the same thing with a neutron or a proton, this is something. Neutrons don't exist in isolation. I think they end up dissolving into a proton, or so like 15 minutes or something. And a proton doesn't exist in isolation because it somehow is unstable and it just immediately collects an electron. So but my point is that it's hard for us to think of oxygen as not oxygen because we can't think of a proton, by the definition and the creation aspect of a proton. The nature of the proton immediately attracts an electron and a neutron. So to some degree, there are things that's like, the Big Bang or whatever it is, I don't know, whatever miracle you want to say started the universe, it just snapped, and things happened based off these efficiency principles. And pretty much immediately, those efficiency principles pull something else. It's like lactate and lactic acid. You don't really get lactic acid. You just get lactate. It immediately just like you don't. It just pulls back in an electron and it oxidizes. And so there are things that like conceptually these things exist, but in reality, the necessary nature of their existence predicts they move into the next thing. And so you go from atoms to molecules, and then molecules to organelles. And so these things aren't there's just a natural law of efficiency for a purpose of like this thing. There's a need that creates the pre-context for the fact that there would be electrons and protons together, that they're naturally going to pull together based off the attraction and compulsion. So the thing that holds these together, the reason I'm spending time on this is because it's the same pattern. It's important to understand from the macro to the micro. The thing that holds these oxygen molecules together is the tension and compression of their shared electrons. The things that hold this oxygen, the atom of oxygen, the elemental atom, is the tension and compression of the compression is the physical existence, the physical nature of the element. The tension is the pull, the attraction of that positive and negative polarity. And so what you get, even though it's not held together by actual physical touching things, it's held together by the same exact forces. And so that scales up. And so this is the important thing. Almost all things we see are just space. There's space in between it. We just see a tiny little thing, the organization of these particles. And so if you look at something like metal or, drywall or your bones, most of that is space, but it's organized because this oxygen, it has 8 electrons, and so the outer valence level has 2 free electrons, so it'll share with another oxygen, or 3, whatever, something like that. That's close enough of a directional definition. And so that creates this very real relationship here that can be broken because you can pull them apart, and so that's what creates a reactivity of things that then combine together to form things like organelles. And so organelles, if you look at the structural hierarchy, it's not that it forms an organelle, it forms the cytoplasm. So what I want you to think about is that if you think about a wall, for example, I could say, oh, that's drywall. Well, drywall is just simply a rigid structure where the atom, the molecules are held together in a pretty consistent path. So, like they're organized. If you look at a DEX table, it'd be like, molecule, 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 molecule. It's just like, a bunch of Legos that are stuck together and held together in the same relationship. So the same thing that holds the atom together holds the molecules together to form containers. And so rather than organelles, I want you to think containers. And the nature and the shape of a box, for example, dictates what you can do. So some boxes can be airtight, some boxes can be cold, like refrigerated. So the structure is similar, but the function we use it is kind of dictated on the purpose we're going to go forth with that. So what you get is organelles are like mitochondria. They create the different shapes and patterns. So like mitochondria have these little squiggly things, and the cytoplasmic reticulum or something. I forgot my biology, but like that's just like long packaging system, which is the long corridor. It's like a maze. And so the shape of the organ and the shape of the structure dictates what the function can be to a degree. So if you have a warehouse, you're not going to shoot fireworks off from it, and you're probably not going to have a fire in it, but you might store stuff in it because it's not rainy. So, the shape of the structure, the dome is going to have a different use cases because it's going to be round or a sphere is going to be different than a triangle. So the shape dictates the energetic things that can pass through and how it's function. And so that's what the organelles do. And so those start to form different shapes that then allow different use cases that then create the next step up. So it's not that a cell necessarily formed because organelles exist, but when enough organelles in different use cases exist that can create a conglomerate, those group together. They create a tension of things that work together. So just like a quarterback is good at throwing a ball, and a lineman is good at blocking something, and a receiver is good at catching the ball, they have different use cases. And just because it's a quarterback doesn't mean that there will be a wide receiver. But in the degree that a wide receiver comes and is catching and start working on that, they kind of necessitate themselves, because who's a quarterback going to throw to if it's not a wide receiver to catch it? And who's a wide receiver going to catch? So you see a set of skills that diverges based off of use cases. So that's part of the divergence of tissue. And so you start to see this growing from the very cell level of an egg, an ovum, or whatever you call that differentiates based off of like, oh, you go here, you go here. And the patterns of that repetition are recorded in our DNA and they're transcribed, so we don't have to do it the first time every single time. But the cell forms because you have a group of these things, and then you have the organization of that team, the 11 guys on a football team, becomes a set of packages. So you can go, you have plays. This is Nickelback, or not Nickelback. Look at this. Sorry. You get this organization, and so this is our dime package. This is, we're going to do our power goal line defense or whatever, special teams. You get these organizations of cells based off of the use case. We need to kick the ball there. We need to throw the ball here. We need to run the ball short distance. That's a cell. And so the organization, the wrapping of that then forms in a predictable pattern based off tension and compression. As those cells grow together, then you start to see divergence of that. You have cell walls, you have biarticulate lipid bilayers and stuff like that start to form that then create multi-cell tissues. And the multi-cell tissues can then diverge for different purposes based off of their use case. And those all function within those create organs, and organs are the soft tissue that then create systems that can communicate with one another. And then there's you. So again, I'm talking about the structure of this. The structure of this is the attraction and repulsion and attraction, or the tension and compression, that literally guides the definition of how this forms. And so there's a formation. Whether or not the function is something that's miraculous, I think we're still trying to figure out how consciousness happens. So like the fact that words and sentences have structure that is different than meaning, but we can't even think about that because we don't think about there's a whole nesting structure of like where you put commas and where you put words within things. That's crazy. That's a whole different thing from the actual word. So like you could look at the structure of the thing. So in so much as we're talking about the structure, because that's where you understand what fascia is, you can get kind of back in and figure out what the function is supposed to be. But how this stuff came to be, I don't know. I think that's just amazing. It seems like there's this guiding piece, but it seems like the important thing is it's emerging at each level. Once the substrate constituent parts are available, something new may emerge if the need is there. So cool thing is, by definition, that you exist and you organize in this way, you are an answer to some problem. You are in the most efficient packaging of some set of preconceived substrates that could have existed for some. That's pretty cool. Yeah. So next level emerges for a purpose. This is the worst slide on here, but I didn't have a better way to I'm just going to read this to you because I was pretty happy how I wrote it. So the tensegrity that holds molecules together is the same as the tension that ties your plantar fascia to your pelvis and holds your stomach in place. At the micro level, the helix structure of proteins twisting around one another creates collagen fibers. This forms the extracellular matrix that connects every cell. I'll explain that. So on the right side, you see this little red thing, this helix structure, and down here, basically there's a twisting. That's how DNA is twisted. There's a rotation that seems to be this kind of like in the same way that electrons and there's a 55-degree angle, I think, is the optimal bend. That's above my pay grade there. But in the same way that there's a necessary relationship between when you go back and you look at oxygen right here, for example, this 55 or 60-degree angles, so to speak, there's a reason for that. There's a reason, and there's a geometry in here that creates some truth in how this is composed and set up. So understand that the organization of that, if you repeated that pattern, you would get some type of coiling and some type of rotation that creates a helix structure. And so from the very level, the molecules that make up proteins start to twist in this helix. And so that starts to form this structure that becomes the basis of the next level. So and maybe this is a better way of understanding it, is that from the molecule level, you have these necessary relationships that exist in geometry. As you group multiple of those together, you got to get these patterns. You get this kind of like, this, I don't know, triangular something, isohexadron. There's something fancy. I don't know enough of that, but you see these repeated patterns, and that repeated pattern over time starts to form a certain aspect, and so the curvature continues, and so you start to see this forming into a helix, and that helix, what was first the compression of the atom that necessarily dictates where the tension is going to pull, then creates the compression of the unit that is a molecule. And so this molecule, the unit here of oxygen, so this, at the first level, it's just the electron, just a neutron, and their relationship forms oxygen. And now this oxygen acts as a solid, acts as a thing in and of itself. And that is the new compression. Just like bones are your compression, they are a thing in and of itself that then has fascia that connects it. The compression here pushes against the attraction, the tension that pulls it there. And so this creates a thing. So that thing then becomes the next to these little dots here. As you organize more and more of those, they start to create some shape, and there's this unity that looks, the geometric unity that organizes certain aspects that then creates bigger things. So the necessary relationship of tension and compression at one level forms the compressive element at the next level. So hopefully that makes sense. The necessary organization of tension and compression at one level forms the compressive element, the thing that is a stable unit at the next level. And so all these molecules then begin to form the compressive unit that is this fiber, this collagen fiber. That starts to exist in relationship to some other attraction element. And so as we get bigger and bigger, we start to see this relationship. So at the micro level, the helix structure, which is this bending thing, of proteins twisting around one another creates collagen fibers. This forms the extracellular matrix that connects every cell, the matrix that forms. So you start to see this web of things. And so within that web, the combination of tension from the collagen fibers and the compression of the cells and fluids they attach to creates the smallest fascial tissues. And so you start to see this pushing and pulling, and this is a divergence. This is an example of like cells starting to pull apart and remodeling. And so you see this tension and compression here. You start to see this in between these cells, and I guess there's the space between them. It fills with fluid. There's cellular components. So remember, like, within this, within these things wrapped around these space, and we think about things like water, but water is just hydrogen, oxygen, two hydrogens and an oxygen pushed together, which is just that. So it's not like there's liquid, maybe a way we feel it and perceive it, but it's not like a thing. At the very basic level, if you got all the way down to stuff, it doesn't look like this because this is the way we imagine it, but this is everything right here. We just can't see it because we see things so big. We see it all like solids and liquids and these major macro level things. And so reality is, you get all the way down there, liquid isn't like a thing. It's not like, why H2O isn't wet and iron isn't hard. It's like the molecule of iron is just electrons and neutrons and protons. The molecule of water is just electrons, neutrons, and protons. Like that's all it is, and you get to the bottom level. So the tension of those things creates this. And so the specific nature of that tension creates this kind of plastic pliable, like stretchy thing. And then to the degree that contains fluid and extracellular water and cells that kind of fill the space that work as a buffer from impact. So fluid tends to have this more like self-correcting tensive thing. That's why most of you see this elastic component. That is what starts to form this relationship of what makes fascia seem wet and makes it seem stretchy because of this relationship of what's between the compressive elements. All right. The combination of tension from the collagen fibers and compression of the cells and fluid they attach to. So again, the tension is now we get this collagen fiber, and I may have said this backwards earlier. The emergent capacity of this creates the necessary form of the next level up. These cells and fluids could be at the micro level. The cells and fluids could be individual muscle fibers or extracellular fluid, like fascial tissues, hold them in place. The grouping of multiple units forms bigger bundles. And so again, you see this emergence. You get a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger. At the very tiny level of your muscle fibers, your myofibrils, those are wrapped in fascia. Your T unit, the contracts and pulls, that's wrapped in fascia. And so again, if you were to take a cross section in any portion of the body, you would see ever smaller groups of these fascial tubes, tubes and the tubes and the tubes. And by tubes, I mean if you cut a wire in half and you look sideways, it looks like a bunch of cylinders. It's the tubes because the fascia is encasing a thing. It's wrapped around it. So the fiber, even though it pulls laterally, if you cut it down the middle, you would see a circle. And so you see within that, you see the major muscle, then you see the minor muscles, and then the smaller cells. And then within the cells, you get these, actin and myosin filaments. And then you see within that, you see the actual thing. It goes all the way down to the atomic level. It just continues to be interconnected. Big tubes wrap around muscles and organs, medium tubes that wrap around or encase circulatory vessels, and little tubes that surround individual cells. So what you get is that it is all emergent based on stimulus. And so this guy on the right, I think that's Keanu Reeves coming out of the Matrix. I just love the idea of you see him experience, he's wrapped in this this kind of, I don't know, this membrane. It's like he's pushing out and creating, and the push out naturally creates the push creates the resistance of the tension. And so to the degree that it breaks, if you break, you see this, it starts off as like this little cell. You get the sperm that comes and creates a point. And I heard this recently that they did a study on frog eggs, that basically it's not so much the DNA component of the sperm, it's the fact that the sphere of the egg is perfect and it doesn't know where to start. And so the sperm, when it penetrates, it gives it a point. It says a point. It's a differentiation. It pushes in and creates a tension. And from that tension, you start to have this extension. So the sperm pushes, it creates a tension and starts to diverge. And then you get the first splitting of the cell in mitosis or whatever you call that. And the cell splits and the point emerges and then it breaks in half. And then that breaks in 4, and then breaks in 8, then in 16. And you see this multiplication, this exponential multiplication that's always just happening because the tension is pulling. And so Keanu Reeves is coming out of this membrane, he's pushing, it is stretching, and is causing divergence of the tissue. This is exactly how and then every single time you get that compressive element of the bone starts to form, and that pulling, the more firm it gets, the harder it gets, the more of a pull and a sensation it puts on the softer tissue. And so you get this combination between the push of the compressive tissue and the pull of the elastic tension tissue, and it creates this relationship. And so you see, for example, the sutures of the 22 bones of the skull that start to emerge. You have this separation that is between different matters, the dura mater and the pia mater, whatever the things you call these are the layers of the skull. This is your skull. That's your brain, by the way. Maybe not your brain, but somebody's brain. And you go up, you start to see this divergence of the layers. And so the layers start to pull, and they actually suck and create suction. They create cavities. They create space. And this is how you start to have space for softer tissues to organize, because the pushing out, the outward divergence of the bones and these denser fascial tissues that create cavities, basically, they're like, we talked earlier about the serous tissue that creates cavities. And then when that vacuum starts to create this tension space, and within that space, you have opportunity for softer tissue. And so again, we think about it as this thing that at this point has a DNA encoding that tells us where we need to organize, what we need to do. But it's no different than if you hand off the football to your running back. The running back isn't going to run hopefully he's not going to run straight into the offensive line. He's going to look for the cavity. Your offensive line are pushing and creating space that lets the space for the running back to go run and sneak through and make positive ground. So it's that same relationship between the thing that forms in the response to create space, and within that space something can form. But it also was the other way, where like the thing that formed that soft tissue was formed from the capacity that it was there. And so in order for this thing to work, it's really hard to think of this as just top down or just bottom up, that's the miracle. That's the amazing thing. It's almost like, how does a thing form without the wisdom to know what it's forming for? Like, that's the crazy thing. And I think oftentimes we do that. Like, let's just say we are intuitively led as people to go and like join some cause, do something, play some sport, and we kind of fit into, well, I'm going to be a quarterback, I want to be a wide receiver, I'm going to be a wide receiver based off some intuitive intelligence of knowing of our body, and that seems to guide our actions. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't diverge. But at the same time, that thing has to exist for us to diverge too. And it's so weird how we do that, and we're guided by some type of group intelligence, which to me would suggest that there's some type of greater guiding hand. It is not mutually exclusive of this natural evolutionary process. I just think it's amazing. And like, it's just amazing once you start to see this. It's like, if you really look at the stuff, it's unbelievable. So from the egg to sperm to the bone and fascia, it's all an emergent. It emerges. We are literally forming and emerging out of this thing. It's a give and take between tension and pressure that forms tissue. All right, this is no way of part 4, and I could probably do a whole different thing, but I'll try and wrap this up. We'll get to this because this is probably the stuff you care about. But that emergence isn't random. It is not a Mother, if you have to go, I do save these and record these, and so I understand if it gets long, and we'll get there. But that emergence is not random. It happens along a predictable pattern of 12 major fascial lines. Now, I'm going to read this and we'll come back to this picture thing, but this is a horrible thing. There's a superficial line that runs from the top of the toes to the side of the neck, superficial front line. That would be this one right here. I think the front, whatever. And this one here. It goes right here along the front of the toes all the way up to the top of the neck. So this is the front of your body. The superficial back line runs from the bottom of the foot, behind the body, to the forehead. This is your posterior chain. So from the bottom of your foot, back of the line, all the way up to the top of your skull. The lateral lines that run along the side of the feet, under the ribs, and side of the neck. So lateral lines here. So this goes, once you start to understand some of the tissue, your fibularis, your IT band, your glute, your ribs, your intercostals, all the way up to the lateral part of your neck. The spiral lines crisscross the entire body, running from the skull to the bottom of the feet, and then back up to create a rotational control around the body. So the spiral line right here. So one of these is spiral lines. I don't know, but I think it's this one. So it's this one. You go around the foot. So this is like the top of the foot, the tibialis. That goes around the IT band, around to the glutes, around across the obliques, up into the your serratus anterior, and around to the neck. The deep front arm line runs from the ribs to the thumb along the front of the arm. This does not show the arm lines, but basically you're just running from, So deep front arm line runs from the ribs to the thumb, so basically inside. So if you put your arm outside from the sternum and go down, the superficial front arm line runs along the sternum, along the inside of the arm to the palm. So they kind of overlap, but so the thumbs, the front arm line goes along the top portion, and then the medial portion is the deep one. That's where you get a real deep stretch. That's where people get a lot of bicep tendonitis and stuff, because they don't get enough extension in there. The superficial back arm line runs from the spine to the scapula to the fingers along the top. Superficial back arm line runs from the deep, or whatever it is, runs from the spine over the shoulder to the back of the hand. So you start to see the back of the body. And the front functional line runs from the shoulder to opposite leg across the belly on each side. So this would be the front functional line here, and the front and the back functional lines. But what you see, that's where you're throwing and twisting and swinging in rotation. That happens there. Run back in the deep front line runs internally from the bottom of the foot to the bottom of the skull. So that's like deep down in here. So that's where you get this this is for people that feel so stiff. It's this is why plantar fascia matters, and why you need to be able to move your feet, and I think this is actually that deep front line, but this goes into your pelvic floor. It wraps around your abdominal cavities. It tucks under your what do you call that? Your diaphragm, up to your ribs. So you're breathing all the way up to your neck. And so what you see is this is what it looks like: your tongue, diaphragm, pelvic floor, hamstrings, your knee, your calf muscles, your Achilles, your toes. What that looks like is this connection. And so the way you want to think about this is like highways. So major highways across, let's say, the United States connect big cities. They go from, interstate highways, or interstate, whatever you call those things. They go from Tulsa to Memphis, or let's go across they go vertical and then horizontal. But you go from Raleigh to Nashville, all the way over to LA. It's Highway 40. You go all the way across the country. And so that's what you want to think about. And so it's not that these are. Another way of looking at them is that these function in the predictable 12 movement patterns. It's not that we only move in 12 patterns, but it's that you start to see muscles that group together for specific tasks. And the tasks we do, like bending over, standing up, leaning sideways, rotating, throwing, swinging, tend to group certain muscles together. And so what you get is a thickening and a connection of these muscles based off of how much the muscles work and how much tension is providing. So imagine it like you're in a city, and everybody wants to go to the same football stadium at the same time. A lot of football analogies today, but everyone wants to go to the same football stadium at the same time. So what they realize is okay, well, we have to go on this path and get on this get on this highway, get on this exit, and go through this stop sign. And so what you see is, in a good response, city planners will say, okay, there's a lot of traffic there, so we're going to make the roads bigger, we're going to make the intersections wider, we're going to pave over the potholes, we're going to make the interstates, we're going to make it beefier. And so what you see is a thickening of the tendons and connective tissue that wrap around this based off of movement. So the more you move, the thicker and more dominant it gets. That's the conditioning of your tissue. So we'll talk about how to remodel this briefly, but the conditioning of your tissue informs where these lines go. And so the thicker you get, the more connected you have, is based off of the movements you do. And typically what you see is this just connects it in these major patterns. So the fascial maneuvers we do, you find, let's say that when we do the beginning with the rotation, that's going to work on this deep, the functional front and back lines where you're rotating and pulling across. But there's rotation, there's flexion, there's extension, and it just, you have to think about the body in global patterns. And so, while yes, there are some times we do isolation movements, most often when we're doing something well, it's pulling the functional capacity of all the different joints and muscles together for a singular purpose. And so that's where you get these fascial lines, which are basically pockets of muscle that exist in fascial encasements that run along multiple sections. So it's super important that you understand that when you have tension in your feet, it's going to relate to tension in your pelvic floor, relate to tension in your spine, and relate to tension in your neck, and so to speak. And so when you move and restore range of motion to this tissue, it reduces the tension in these other areas. So this is why I kind of joke when people say, like, they have arthritis. You might have arthritis because your fascial encasement has gotten so bad, but it's like they'll say, oh, arthritis has no cure, you can't reverse it. It's like, well, that's because you're just looking at the actual degradation of the tissue. It's like you're thinking about your body like the brake pads on a car, which is you break down, eventually they're a finite tissue, they just wear down, it is what it is, running is bad for your joints. And it's like, no, there's a fascial encasement. So if you move in congruence with your body, your bones don't touch. Very few of the bones touch. And so, and by touch, they are suspended. There is some articulating cartilage that can smooth over that. But when because obviously we have compression, we have some things we have to move, and the body's, nothing's perfect. So we have articulating cartilage, but they are suspended and held in a web of very dense fascia. So it connects the bones, it connects the joints, it connects the ligaments and tendons. All this stuff is suspended, and these movement patterns. So when we just break the part into segmented categories, we lose the fact for this integrated whole that needs to function together. And that is how you end up with bone-on-bone contact. And of course you have degradation, but that's addressing the degradation of your bone and bone isn't going to fix arthritis. Fixing arthritis is removing the pressure in the first place. So it changes the way you think about things like the itises, like tendinitis, patellar tendinitis, fascial tendinitis, or plantar fasciitis. Like all of these things, the irritations. Well, it's because you're not getting the tissue's gotten stiff and it's now like contracting and pulling the whole thing in. And so you're pulling in into compressor structures that then either have to minimize the compression and basically lose bone mass and like continue to shrink down, or you just restore pliability and reduce you change the tissue that is doing the pulling. And so that changes the relationship. So all these pain syndromes, these achy things, these weird things that happen, you start to see differently in relation to your fascia, which is just connecting with your muscles to disperse force. Yeah, I think that was it there. So the last slide. We're at the last two slides. Doesn't mean I can stop talking, but so we'll talk briefly on how to remodel this conceptually, because this probably would be best done as like I'll actually come back and do this in a different talk about like massage and stretching and stuff like that, because that's people care about it. But conceptually, there are two steps to restoring your fascial line, because yes, we all get it. In a perfect world, conceptually you'd be able to run, jump, and basically your emergent body that comes and pressures, and as you start to identify as a system and your body starts to move and you're a baby, now you're like, okay, let me try and get core pressure so I can turn my head around. Let me get core segmentation so I can move my spine and rotate. Let me get the ability to balance on one foot, to put pressure, to deal with a suspended system, to walk, to hop, to skip. And so these things, before our body has disruptions in our kinetic chain, we're just absorbing the forces of gravity and we're moving around and we're absorbing. And so that is creating this continual emergent relationship with the ground, with gravity, with nature. And we are forming a healthy kinetic chain. Somewhere along the way, whether that's it could be a nutritional thing. It could be a loss of stimuli for light, for sound. It could be a disruption of sleep. It could be a toxin exposure. It could be a birth defects, all these. It could be anything that interrupts when you're doing this such massive, like the first trimester, there's so many different cell proliferations and this emergent process of tension and compression over and over again, that can get disrupted. And if it gets disrupted by the introduction of some exogenous things, some toxins, something, I don't know, just a lack of something, a number of things you can have, or just even just the fact that it's not always perfect, it's like things just sometimes go left to right, like there's part of this ideation process where we're kind of moving in a new direction. Sometimes there's things that are interesting. So, but the point is that by the time you've gotten to a system, by the time you have made it all the way to full launch, meaning you're a baby that is out screaming and crying, there is enough structural integrity of your body that, I guess by the time you've made it, past the first few months, because people can still have, the babies can still die early on just from like not fully forming, but by the time you get to that point, there is a unity and a structural integrity of your system that knows how to function in itself. And so the rest of that happens based off the stimuli you get. And so there's any number of things that can throw that off. It's a very complex thing. And there's billions of people. And it's a lot of people that have to go and get this right and continue to practice and refine it. So it's not like a given by anything. And so I think it's not something to be Pollyannish and say, it's always perfect. It's always going to work out. It's like, yeah, things, but the cool thing is that even if things didn't work out perfectly as a kid, we have the ability to go back with intention and kind of redesign ourselves to a degree. That is as close to the gospel as I could ever think of. You're never beyond redemption. You're always capable of possibly moving in a direction of like, okay, if I start to let go of this movement pattern and choose a different movement pattern, a belief set, ideology, etc., I can change and shift to that, and that's beautiful. So in the perfect setting world, we grow up, we're running, jumping, skipping, our bodies are organized, we're happy, blah, blah, blah. But then we have puberty and all this stuff, and we get injured and things like that, and we get, whatever, stuff happens. And so how do we undo that? Conceptually, there's two steps. First, restore range of motion. Second, condition the tissue. So restoring range of motion looks a lot like massage and stretching, but it's a different focus. So massage that focuses on the specific treat muscles like dumb sacks of meat, like, oh, I'm going to just massage this and work on muscle knots and get all this stuff. You're treating the body as though there's no intelligence. You're not asking why that's there. So to the best of our knowledge, muscle knots are areas of fascia that don't get movement. And so you get this dehydration, you get these proteins and these different metabolites and binding factors that kind of get things stuck. You don't have movement. So without the sticking, you get a loss of circulation that creates this kind of toxic buildup of just things that are nasty in there. That's there's no one knows, but the closest we have from my hypothesis is somewhere on this. But basically, there's points of tension. But there's also points of tension where there's hypersensitivity because the fascia is not getting moved and it's getting stuck, and so it's kind of like ripping a Band-Aid off. There's a loss of fluidity there. There's a loss of connection. There's a loss of circulation. So there's a lot of things that go into it. But basically, just there are points where you're no longer connecting with the muscle and moving in the way you should. So massage can be helpful because it fast responds to very slow, long stretch time movement and pressure. So you can get in and use your fingers or massage ball to create pressure, which is basically a form of movement. If I push in, I'm creating movement that then starts to kick off this, really removing some of this hyaluronic acid. Then you have to stretch, which is, I think it's 3 millimeters per second. It has to be very slow for your fascia to move. And like you're thinking, this point is basically stretching on individual. You're trying to work towards individual fibers. And so just like a stick is not very strong by itself, but a bundle of sticks is, the body, when in doubt, will tends up to have a bundle of sticks. It kind of groups up into this, like, I'm going to do this. Just like if you're going to, have a therapy session, you're going to talk about something that's very sensitive, and you're kind of working on individual ideas, individual memories, individual concepts. And it's like, it's very novel. You're thinking, okay, maybe that was mean. Maybe I did like that. Maybe I was happy. That's a very tender spot you're going to be in. So you're going to go slow. You're going to think. You're going to be mindful. You're going to be very vulnerable, but you're also going to be very hypersensitive because when they come up, they make a joke, I'm going to tense up. And now I'm going to tense up all my ideas and go back into, no, I'm this, I'm that, and I can't believe you voted for them, blah, blah, whatever it is. You go to that, and it's just like groupthink where you're not very smart. You're just like, bleh, and it's not fun. But the point is, when you're working on these individual tissues, you have to be slow. You have to be mindful. You can't have too much pressure. You can't have too much speed. You have to just feel your body, and you're slowly starting to pull the viscoelastic tissue. Your body is like 70% water, and most of that water is this deuterium depleted water, which your body creates itself, but it's stored in the space. Remember, it's the chemical composition of fascia. So there's this connected inner web. Obviously, your fluid, your digestive fluid, your blood, and the interstitial fluid and the fluid between cells. All that fluid is just basically this fascial tissue that is creating the tension component. So again, it's like the fluid. There's if you've ever seen like the top of a glass where like I forget what they call it, the sticking thing where like the tension, the surface tension of water that kind of like pulls it up. That's why it's fluid, because it has this tension to stretch while still maintaining its form. It can kind of pull apart while still maintaining a whole, as opposed to a solid which can't separate, it can't pull. So the fluid, the necessary, again, this the most efficient organization of that thing for that purpose. And so fluid organized in that way for that purpose, to maintain a connection with something while still maintaining a hold. And so what you get is that fluid starts to fill up, and so the body maintains all this fluid. It's what keeps you healthy and plump and happy and hydrated, and buffers impact, because it's just much more forgiving than hitting a bone directly, or you can hit a bursa sac, or a muscle belly, or a fluid cavity. So the fluid starts to form, and so in that space, we're getting small individual tissues, and that's the viscoelastic property. So viscous, or elastic means it returns to its original shape, and viscous means it has some type of it's in between solid and it's a spectrum of solid to liquid properties. So we're restoring that. We're getting motion. We're getting body. We're literally hydrating and getting our body lubed up again. We're ready to roll. So that's how you should restore some range of motion. And you have to pair that with your muscle. So there's a whole different thing to talk about, but a muscle intentional contraction, because people just start with the rehab process, and we talked about this with Achilles tendonitis. They start with the fascia, they start with the stretching, the massage. Oh, because someone else can do it for me, and it feels good, and I can put my little, vibrating massage gun on there, and oh yeah, we're good. It's easy, it's passive. I don't have to sweat. It ain't gonna get you anywhere, because you have to sweat. You have to train your body, train your muscles to contract, and muscles are just the emotional connection to an emotional intelligence and a physical tie into our proprioceptive awareness of like, I'm going to contract and feel this. That tension pulls. So if I squeeze my pec, it pulls necessarily on the pec tendon. If I squeeze my calves, it pulls necessarily on the calf tendon. So the intentional stretch, the stretched out movements of fascial maneuvers, you start because I can pull my body in a position passively, but then I also have to go and train that with force and be able to create strength and power. So that's the muscular side of it. Then you have to condition that. So the fascial side happens with slow, stretched out positions. The muscular side is intentional connection to the body. And the plyometric side, which is rapid, quick conditioning. So we have to condition the letter. You have to get you have to say, if I'm going to be a javelin thrower, I have to condition my pec tendon to be stronger. And so that's why you see this conditioning, necessary thickening, but without losing the pliability of the tissue. So it's this combination of like continuing to restore long range strength with the short range muscle contraction, and you pair that with the conditioning of your movement of your muscles and your tissue with repetitive rhythmic plyometric movement, jumping, hopping, skipping, throwing, rolling, catching, carrying, throwing, whatever, all of these things. Those are the movements that form the fascial lines. And so those fascial lines happen along lines of stress. And so what you see is that you have to go back and jump and skip and hop to have your Achilles be strong. You have to learn to sprint if you want to have a full connective to your body. And when you see all these fascial lines connected to the feet, for the most part, you start to see how strong the feet need to be and how connected and mobile they need to be in order to connect to the rest of the fascial lines of the whole body. So it all comes back full circle, which is, I can explain the whole thing. It's important having a relationship of like the micro to the macro. But the beautiful thing is that when you connect, because it's all connected from the micro to the macro, when you do fascial maneuvers, when you move, you're literally connecting with the very atoms that form the smallest crevices and cavities of your body. So the big movements, the global movements, do have a resonating path at fractal-like level patterns over and over and over again that creates a tension and a compression on the entire system. Your body is so fucking brilliant and incredibly stitched together that every single thing you can do, you at the top can create a movement that then resonates all the way down to every single cell of your body. Unbelievable. And so that's when people are like, people that don't understand this, they tap into something. You can do organ massage, you can move your tissue, you can breathe. There's mindfulness. It's like it's all pulling and pushing on the tissue and changing the tension, changing your perception of it, which changes your body, which changes the compression on the hormone production glands, the compression on your blood vessels, which changes. And we haven't touched on the lactate and the acidity of your blood and how it all changes the relationship of your brain's interpretation of your nervous system. Like you have acidity that gets higher in your blood that you have to buffer, and so that triggers a stressor in your amygdala, which makes you higher state, which changes your breathing, it changes your posture. It's all related. And so if you overlook that pattern. You overlook that relationship. What you end up with is this kind of isolated view of like, well, my ACL is torn, my Achilles is stiff. It's like, no, it's all connected, and it all has to do. If you want to fix one thing, the input you put in, the nutrition, the way you're able to digest, if you can digest, the breathing you do, the movement you do, the perception you have of the world, the intention you set changes how you breathe, changes the movements you do, it changes your body. So it is like this, like as far as we can see, the upper limit is near infinite because all of these things are there. And what would you look like if you actually took yourself seriously and set your intention on the highest good you could do and actually lived as such and was mindful of these things and moved with intention? Your body would shape and form in a different way. And so you sort of see the physical therapy model and the cognitive behavior therapy model as these weird things that we created sisters. It's like there's all one thing, and you have to be able to put it together. And so true rehabilitation, returning to play, is as much a mindset as it is a movement pattern, as it is a tissue remodeling. It's like it's all there. So yeah, I think the last step is why you've never heard of this before. And this is just a little side rant, but you might think this sounds great. I like this stuff. For the one person is Keon, so I'll be the only guy that's still up there. But you might think, well, this is great. Why have I never heard of this before? Why my physical therapist not talk about this? And why is it, only thing I hear is myofascial release, which is like basically foam rolling, or like plantar fascia. Well, it's messy. You see how long it took to explain that? It's because I'm not very good at it yet, and I'll get better at it. But it's messy because everything is connected. It's like spaghetti. Spaghetti is messy. It's all one big mess of stuff. And there's a beautiful symmetry. You can sort of pick it apart with these global things that then have these fractal like patterns that repeat down. So if you can see it at the micro, you can see it at the macro, and if you can see it at the macro, you can see it at the micro. But the thing is, you can't productize it. Insurance companies can't monetize it. You can't say, well, you know what, you got some knee arthritis because of his entire fascial suit is off, and they don't know how to breathe, and their eating is off, and missing nutrients. They're not grounding. They have a poor movement pattern. They can't rotate their spine, so the pelvic floor is stiff, and their feet have been bunioned from wearing shoes and orthotics. So we're gonna have to unwrap the whole body, because if you pull on one thread, you pull on the whole thing. And insurance models can't say, well, yeah, that's knee arthritis. Okay, we'll do a knee replacement. That's going to cost $12,000. We have to do MRI, get the MRI tech to do it. We have to have physical therapy, go through afterwards, and that's going to be 24 sessions, and so that should be this much money. And again, I forget who I was talking to about this. Actually, it was a podcast I just did. You exist is a wild thing. The wilderness, the flowers, all of life is this wilderness thing. And our human proclivity, this kind of masculine urge to go and like organize, the left brain thing to go like, I'm going to organize, I'm going to chop it down, is basically taking all of that and putting it in numbers in a spreadsheet, binary zeros and ones, and trying to contract it. But somewhere along the way, if I take you as a person, start to, I need to get you down to this box, and I need that box to be numbered. I need to be how much is your life insurance policy worth? I got to chip, and everything's chipping at you from the time you're a kid. You're growing up, and you haven't even finished your ideation as a child, and they start put you in shoes, put you in pants, put you to go to school, put you in a chair, tell you what to think, tell you how to talk. And part of that is you're shaping you up to be in society. So it's not a bad thing in and of itself, because pure wilderness is chaos, and that ain't good. But the point is, we got to understand that at some point we have to fight back against that, because the chipping away, like the taking this wild shape and kind of chip, like Michelangelo, instead of carving David, he carved a block. It's like you just chip away down to where there's nothing human about it. It's just as modern right angles and like horrible modern not mid-century, but like this kind of weird architecture we see today, which is like glass and sharp edges and like inhuman things. It's like this mechanical aspect, and so we're trying to make us into a machine. It's like it ain't gonna work. And you show it's comprehensive. But the most important part is it requires your participation. And in an insurance and medical model that says people are patient compliance is so low, they won't take the medicine, they won't do their thing, they won't do the exercises, it's a very nihilistic, hopeless society, and so a hopeless endeavor. And so they're saying, well, if it requires you to actively feel and participate, it ain't gonna happen. And people are they're much happier. Well, it couldn't have been different. And the doctor said it's arthritis, there's no cure for it, it just is what it is. And nope, it is what it is. Out of my hands. I can't control it. Let's go watch what's on Netflix. They have a new show. Okay, but it's like Tom Brady got roasted. Yeah, like that's what we do. We just go to the next thing and we kind of give up. And we don't realize that by giving up on the one thing, the fractal-like nature of this is that we start to contract and we die as people. And you start to see people that shrink. They start to get contorted in weird ways, and their body gets off limits, and their mind starts to stick, and they start to have these weird neurological disorders when they get in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Well, guess what? It's a direct relationship to your personality, your outlook on life, and how you specifically chose to or not to engage with your body, which is a reflection of how you choose to engage with life. It's all related, and it requires your participation. So